Is it all just for himself personally? Donald Trump has already made his decision. Since there have been several rounds of his meetings with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, we can more than confidently assume that at the core of all these conversations, in every round of these meetings, was the possibility of a military operation against Iraq. It's no secret that Israel is interested in such an operation, and in fact is interested in its possible strategic outcome to launch the process of regime change in Tehran, but Israel understands perfectly well that on its own, without its strategic ally, the United States of America, it cannot do this. Or, let's put it this way, the cost of such an operation for Israel would be too high. And in this sense, we saw how the Prime Minister of Israel, who is a personal friend of the American President Donald Trump, systematically and very skillfully convinced Trump that this operation needed to be carried out. All the more so because there was something to appeal to. There was a successful case, successful primarily from Donald Trump's point of view. The strikes by American strategic aviation on Iran's nuclear facilities, which again, in Trump's eyes, should have set back the Iranian nuclear program by decades. But apparently that did not happen. And on the one hand, in order to fix this situation, and on the other hand, to recreate all that hype and the PR campaign that Trump and his entourage launched around the previous military operation, most likely Bibi Netanyahu was appealing to such things. And in fact, we saw how at the same time, Trump, obviously so that later he wouldn't be accused of, let's say, straying too far from the MAGA course. He promised that he wouldn't start any new wars, and yet here he is starting new wars and so on. And well, I think, by the way, that's why Trump is now actively communicating that he's giving advice. He's asking everyone, he asks these people, and he asks those people. And again, this is most likely to cover up the fact that he has already made a final decision and to create the illusion that he is still hesitating. And so until the very last moment, he wasn't sure whether it was necessary to do this. And in fact, considering that at the same time the Iranian leadership was also trying to somehow imitate negotiations, it's obvious they took cues from their Kremlin counterparts. And we saw that in reality, even those negotiations that took place in Geneva, our attention was primarily focused on the negotiations between the American, Ukrainian, and Russian sides. But at the same time, the Americans were also meeting with the Iranians there. These were indirect negotiations, but nevertheless, this track was present, and we saw, so to speak, the evolution of Tehran's official position on these talks, because initially Washington presented Tehran with 3 conditions under which there would be no strikes, and essentially Iran could more or less count on some kind of regional stability. The first condition was the cessation of uranium enrichment, that is, in fact, the halting of Tehran's nuclear program. The second demand was the termination of Tehran's missile program, that is, the elimination of the threat from Iranian medium and long-range ballistic missiles, primarily those capable of reaching Israel, to other allies of the United States in the region, and also to stop developing ballistic missiles that could potentially reach even farther. And the third condition from Washington was that Tehran must cease all funding, assistance, sponsorship, logistics, and so on for its terrorist proxy regimes in the region. That means Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And in fact, Tehran's position was that the last 2 points were not up for discussion, but the first point could be negotiated. There was even a proposal from the Ayatollahs. Let's do joint business projects. Everyone likes to offer Trump business projects. By the way, that's the right approach. Joint business projects with Americans on peaceful nuclear energy, uranium enrichment, and nuclear programs. Let the Americans participate, and then there should be a guarantee that Iran will not use its nuclear program components to try to make nuclear weapons. It was clear that, well, let's say Russia was the primary consultant to Iran because during this period there were active visits by representatives of the Ayatollah regime to Moscow, as well as by Kremlin representatives to the region. And then we saw an evolution in Tehran's position. That is, their stance on the first point changed dramatically, and Iran began to say that, no, the nuclear program is our sovereign right, and we will not give it up. And at the same time, the Kremlin jumps in with its traditional proposal. Because throughout this whole story, we understand that the Putin regime is trying to sell itself to Trump as a mediator, as a negotiator, to help Trump himself and his circle make a deal specifically regarding Iran. And in fact, this initiative has already been voiced by the Kremlin, but now the Kremlin has decided to return to it again. From all the loudspeakers of Russian propaganda, the thesis is being spread that supposedly the Russian Federation is ready to accept on its territory, thank you, that enriched uranium which the Ayatollahs will continue to work with to further enrich it. This
is blackmail, plain and simple. This is outright blackmail.
First of all, it's blatant blackmail, and secondly, we perfectly understand that on Russian territory, Russian engineers will use this Iranian enriched uranium to assemble a nuclear bomb for the Ayatollahs. This is something the Ayatollahs can't do themselves because they don't have their own expertise, practically speaking, in this sense. And then to hand over this bomb, because after that, no one said anything about the bomb anymore. In reality, such an evolution in Tehran's position is definitely dictated in sync with the Kremlin. And this was definitely part of Putin's strategy ahead of the Geneva negotiations, to try to sell himself to Trump as a mediator on the Iranian issue. If Trump had swallowed the bait, then Putin would have demanded concessions and favors in return from Trump on the Ukrainian front regarding how much the American delegation would pressure the Ukrainian side, specifically during the Geneva negotiations. But now we see that Trump, thanks to the efforts of Bibi Netanyahu, his best friend, is actually preparing for war. And these Kremlin plans to somehow try to sell themselves as mediators in the Iranian negotiations so far have not produced any tangible results at all.
We understand, Taras, that at the same time, the Kremlin dictator, or rather his friend, does have major problems. And again, the news is that aviation is gathering near the border early. Here. At the airbase, there are many electronic warfare aircraft for suppressing air defenses. At least 18 fifth-generation F-35A fighter jets have been recorded, along with deployed Patriot and TAT air defense systems. The Americans are also building additional concrete shelters and strengthening defenses. So in fact, this airfield is currently being transformed into a major United States Pentagon military installation for a potential future military scenario. And what is your personal perspective on this matter? Do you believe it is possible that we will see a repetition of the political crisis seen in the Venezuelan scenario?
Well, let's say the Venezuelan scenario is no longer an option here because that should have been done at the very beginning, and it should have been done during the protests. Then, theoretically, it could have worked. But now, after Trump praised his so-called discombobulator, which they used in Venezuela, and so on, and after it became obvious to the Ayatollahs that the strategic goal of both the United States and Israel is in fact regime change in Iran, I think that now, precisely in this direction, both the IRGC and generally the Iranian intelligence services have started working very closely. That is, well, let's say things like this are done without any announcement. By the way, this is actually one of the reasons why it worked in Venezuela. Because, well, people only found out about it after the fact and only when everything was over and Maduro was already outside the territory of Venezuela. Well, here it's a different geography, a different geopolitical landscape, a different region. And in fact, Iran itself has a completely different military and political potential. And considering that for Iran, let's say, primarily in terms of military confrontation with Israel and the coalition of Western countries, this is, roughly speaking, already the third time that Iran has gotten involved in such a confrontation in the past 2 years. So in reality, well, let's say fully repeating the Venezuelan scenario and managing with only such limited resources is definitely not going to work for Trump anymore. And in fact, Trump understands this perfectly well, because to the list you mentioned, I would add 2 more aircraft carrier groups. That's almost 300 carrier-based aircraft, missile cruisers, and missile submarines that are part of the carrier groups. These are usually American. Well, and I'm not even mentioning the fact that at a minimum, about 50 additional aircraft have been transferred to the airfields of allied countries. Plus, there are support aircraft, long-range airborne early warning planes, refuelers, tankers, and so on. So in reality, this preparation for a military operation has already been going on for several months. And even when we look closely at what we see in the official public space, the specific information that is being presented to us, the same representatives of the Pentagon are publishing this information. In fact, this is quite a large-scale operation. And the United States Department of Defense in the General Staff is preparing for a prolonged confrontation. There is even information that, according to estimates by the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, this operation could take several weeks or even several months. And in fact, judging by the resources that the United States is accumulating in the region, they are preparing precisely for this kind of scenario.
Taras, let's literally discuss the issue of Ukraine right now, because everything that's happening, everything connected to the Kremlin and its allies, is directly related to Ukraine as well. A scenario where Trump says yes, and a scenario where Trump does nothing regarding the Iran issue. What should Ukraine expect and how should it respond?
We need to understand that these events cannot have any absolutely direct impact on the situation in Ukraine, but indirectly, this influence will definitely be there and it will definitely be felt. At the very least, based on what we've already mentioned, if the negotiation game continues, then let's say for us, there remains the risk that the Kremlin will still try to push through this position and sell itself as a mediator on the Iran issue because, well, of course, we understand that Trump is wavering, and we remember that in the first iteration, the previous time when the Kremlin tried to sell its services to Trump in this regard, Trump was in that position. There was all this hype about American B-2 strategic bombers striking Iran's nuclear facilities, and at that time, Trump rather sharply rebuffed Putin, in the sense that Putin would be better off dealing with the Russia-Ukraine war and thinking about how to end it, rather than coming to me with advice and mediation on Iran. That was pretty tough, even for Trump, considering this is his friend Vladimir. Nevertheless, Trump was riding the wave of military glory. As the Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America, and actually, the Kremlin waited until these passions died down, and now they're trying to do it again. So far, everything points to the fact that there will be a military operation, and they won't succeed. But again, if we consider as a possible scenario the option where Trump refrains from a military operation, then again, that means the Kremlin will obviously try to do something similar. And in one of the rounds, during one of the rounds of Russian, Ukrainian, American negotiations, they will try to get the Americans to once again put pressure on Ukraine. If the situation develops in such a way that a military operation does take place, then, first and foremost, of course, everything will depend on how events unfold, on how effective and massive Iran's retaliatory strikes will be, primarily against Israel and American military facilities in the region. How effective and successful these strikes will be, and how Trump will respond. To put it another way, if he is indeed completely set on engaging in such a conflict that is not immediate, but is rather more of a medium-term war, then that is certainly one possible scenario that we should keep in mind. But if he retreats after these initial strikes, then it will be a completely different story, one involving a loss of reputation, his personal reputation, which I think on the eve of the November elections, the midterms for the Senate and Congress, he simply cannot allow to happen. So most likely he will fight to the end. But again, everything will depend on how successfully Israel and the United States can jointly achieve this strategic goal, the regime change in Tehran. If regime change does occur, it will be a colossal blow to the so-called axis of evil. That is, in this sense, Iran is one of the foundations of this axis of evil. And we understand this perfectly well. On the one hand, the Russian Federation has already received the main military assistance from Iran that it was counting on. They are already assembling their own Shaheds there and so on. Nevertheless, let's say Iran's partnership in this regard, of course, does not quite reach the level of North Korea's partnership with the Russian Federation, but still, Iran plays its role. But this blow to the axis of evil 2.0 will be more psychological. That is, if the axis of evil 2.0 does not protect its ally and simply lets this ally fall, then let's say the West can start planting doubts in the minds of that same circle. Kim Jong-un, yes, and say, well, if you have such problems, are you sure that, for example, the Kremlin or Beijing will come to your aid? Because they didn't come to help your friend Maduro. They didn't come to Venezuela either, even though everyone was happily buying from them. They pumped oil from there, mixed it with their own, and so on. So this effect will be there, but again, first of all, it will be delayed. And secondly, unfortunately, it will not have a direct impact on us.
Taras, we suggest meeting again on our program next time to discuss this logic behind Trump's actions, because it seems that the attempt to bribe, to sell a soap bubble, a pig in a poke to Putin is not very successful. And Trump has already imposed sanctions, and now we see the next step, which is quite serious. Thank you very much for